ever suffered depression, phobia, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or other debilitating illnesses and have not been able to identify the source of those illnesses, well, this episode will be of interest to you. Today, we are going to be talking about healing ancestral wounds because you see, sometimes the illnesses that we're carrying aren't even ours. They belong to generations that have passed, that have come before us. Welcome to the Journey to Legacy show. I'm your host, Joanna Klein. I am the creator and facilitator of Journey to Legacy, an online life story writing course for women in their third act. And today we're going to be exploring something that is very profound within our own personal stories and looking at how we might be able to heal some things that we are carrying that don't even belong to us. Now, when I first started researching this topic for my Journey to Legacy course, I came across an article written by Dr. Judith Rich, written in 2011 on the website, the Huffington Post website. And I was so excited to see that Dr. Rich had written this article because I had recently been in a leadership program where Dr. Rich was one of the amazing leaders. And I had so resonated with what she shared, with what she had to offer. And so to see that she had actually written an article related to this topic was so exciting for me. So I invited her to come be on this show and have this discussion with us about it. Let me read Dr. Rich's bio to you so you'll get a sense of just how fortunate we are to have her here today. Dr. Judith Rich is a pioneering teacher in the field of transformation and consciousness. She is an accomplished transformational and leadership development trainer with nearly 50 years experience in training, facilitation, personal and executive coaching, and public speaking. Her work, focused on the awakening of one's dormant inner resources, encourages contribution, participation, and discovery, which makes the individual an integral part of his or her own learning process and empowers profound personal and professional breakthroughs for individuals and organizations throughout the United States, Europe, Russia, Asia, and South America. Dr. Rich is the author of the international best-selling book, Beyond the Box, Lean Out, Break Free, Rise Up, published in 2018, which provides tools to support one reinventing oneself, building courage, and creating a brave new life beyond what is already known, safe, and comfortable. Her quote, "We are evolving into a new species of humans who no longer have comfort as an option. We must learn to become comfortable being uncomfortable." On her 80th birthday, Judith launched a podcast, The New Beyond, available wherever podcasts are found. Her podcast invites listeners to go beyond where they think they can go. Dr. Judith Rich, welcome. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm really delighted to be here.
It was really I was so excited when I'm, doing this research and finding your name attached to this article that was written so many years back. So I would love to start with that. Like, share, if you would, the origin of you even writing that article about us having this ability to heal ancestral wounds.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. Uh, I didn't even know it was a thing myself, even though I too, as I think most people are, carrying ancestral wounds. I probably still carry them, and I've done a lot of work in healing, but I wasn't even aware that it was a thing until I came across the concept, a belief from the Lakota Sioux indigenous tribe, who have a belief that our actions, our behaviors, our conditioning impacts 14 generations,
Mm.
in either 7 in each direction, so that the actions that we take, it seems obvious that would impact generations going forward. Obviously, I think we're setting up and changing patterns and conditions going forward. But the Lakota Sioux belief is that we impact 7 generations behind us. So I thought that was really interesting idea and concept. I'd never thought about it before. And it got me thinking about my own life
Mm.
and about a lot of my experiences as a leadership trainer, experiences that I've had with people in trainings, experiences that I've had coaching people one-on-one. And then I had an interesting dream, if I may share this dream, that
Please.
really piqued my curiosity. So I'm sure this dream came about. I believe that the soul speaks to us in part through the language of our dreams.
Mm.
And that this was, I believe, this was really a message to support me in my journey of discovering what this was all about, making it relevant to me. So in the dream, I'm standing before a long table of what seemed to me enlightened beings. They were beings of light. I couldn't see their faces.
Mm.
They were all in white. They were seated at a long table. I called them the committee.
Mm.
I'm standing in front of the committee and I look down at the ground at my feet, and there's a line that's drawn in either the sand or the earth, whatever I was standing on. There was a line. And so in the dream, one of the enlightened beings speaks to me, and I'll call it they, uncertain about what kind of pronoun to use for beings that really transcend every idea of gender. They said to me, before you is a line. If you choose to cross this line, if you step across this line, you will bring with you all of your ancestors.
Mm.
To me, in the dream, I intuitively knew that line represented a step forward in consciousness,
Mm.
crossing a line into a new realm of consciousness. And so without hesitation in the dream, I could see behind me into infinity my ancestral lineage.
Mm.
And they were all standing behind me, and they all had their hands on the shoulders of the one in front of them, and someone's hands were on my shoulders. And so without hesitation, I stepped across the line. And when I did that, I felt this energetic swoosh, this swoosh of energy just rush through me. It was like, it woke me up. It was so powerful and strong. It woke me up. I woke up into this awareness. Oh, wow, something just happened.
Mm.
And that was it. But I knew it was a really important message to me. And so that really sparked the beginning of a conscious journey of examining my own ancestral wounding, my own lineage, unfinished business, if you will. And as I began that process in myself, of course it manifested in my experience in my life.
Mm.
For example, if I may share a story, I was leading a training in Russia, in the town of Ijevsk, which is, well, by U.S. standards, it would be considered a big city. It was over 1 million people, to the east of Moscow, kind of to the southeast of Moscow. And in this training experience, there is a part, for you, it was a breakthrough training, so you kind of have the context.
Mhm.
There is a part of the training experience where people are encouraged and invited to express their trauma, to express their feelings, their sadness, their grief, their pain, express their pain. And normally, when I invite people into that kind of experience, it takes some coaxing to get people to participate because it's not easy to just be in a room full of people and suddenly start crying and start expressing and emoting and all of that, even though we're
Mhm.
using music and we're supporting in a lot of various ways. In Russia, this was not the case. And in particular, this particular training in Russia, the people absolutely went for it. Their eyes were closed, we're playing music, Russian music, and they're sobbing and crying and, emoting, kind of the likes of which I had never really experienced before, even though I'd been doing this work already at that time
Mhm.
for decades.
Mhm.
And with this particular group, it went on and on and on for over an hour, unprompted, unsupported, unfacilitated by myself or the staff. And it would go in waves. It would go like as a group. It was almost like a flock of birds, how you see, birds that will dart and move and dash, and or waves that would rise and rise and rise and then crash. The group emotional experience kind of went like that. It would crest and then fall and then build and crest and fall. And it went on that way for a very long time, over an hour. And finally, when it finally ended, I couldn't speak. The energy was so palpable in the room.
Mhm.
And after, we just sat there in silence for a long time, just really being connected to what just occurred.
Mhm.
Finally, after some time, through my interpreter, I asked the group, "What was this?" And their response was, "This was the suffering
Mhm.
of the world.
Mm. Wow.
This was the suffering of the world." And what blew me away was their awareness that it wasn't even their own suffering,
Mm.
that it came through them
Mhm.
and they expressed it and they knew it in the moment.
Mm. Mm. Wow.
That was, even as I recount that experience, I kind of the hairs on my
Mhm.
arms and my body just kind of are raising and tingling. I
Mhm.
recall that experience so vividly. It was so powerful. And it was a demonstration of what
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
That in the Russian culture, as in many cultures, I don't think Russia is unique in this, but there's even a term for it called
Mm.
Russian suffering.
Mhm.
There's even a term for it, that they recognize. And when they say Russian suffering, they're speaking about the suffering of their ancestors
Mhm. Mhm.
and as it occurs for them today.
Yeah.
So there are other cultures outside of our Western culture here in America, and probably most other Western cultures that have been tuned into this
Yeah.
concept
Yeah.
for who knows how long.
It's so powerful. I know I had a personal experience as well, where yeah, I teach a life story writing course, and when I started writing about my relationship with my father, which was always a very difficult relationship, I got in touch with something that I hadn't really connected to, and I know all my life that I've had this anxiety that I could never identify the source of that anxiety. It wasn't as if I grew up in a home that I didn't have any traumas that I could remember as a child, But when I started writing about what I remember about my father, who passed away when I was like 37, uh, I there were stories that had been told to me. His mother died when he was 5 months old during the Spanish flu during that pandemic in 1918.
Mm.
He was sent away. His father couldn't care for him. He lived in foster homes. He was beaten. He had a lot of trauma as a young boy, and what this process of writing about it helped me identify, and then learning about this whole concept of epigenetics, which I want to mention a little bit more about that too, but recognizing that I was carrying something that didn't belong to me. It
Mhm.
was really something that had been passed down to me. And so I got that on an emotional, spiritual, conscious level, that I can let go of this. It's not mine. And
Yes.
I can, in just bringing it and being aware of it, and then having compassion for my father, which is something that I didn't have. I resented him because we didn't have a good relationship, but there was this healing that felt like this weight off of my shoulders, and I could just feel as if it's something that went back generations as a result of my awareness. So it
Yeah.
sounds like something similar to what you're describing.
Yes. And I have my own experience with that in my own story, that primarily involves my mother, not
Mm,
my father. Um, and it took me decades. I mean, I lived my whole life not being aware because, kind of like your story, I grew up in a family where there wasn't visible wounding.
mhm,
Nobody was an alcoholic, nobody was a drug addict, that kind of thing.
right.
And so the trauma wasn't as visible, but I experienced in myself, and I didn't know the story about it until my mother was in her late 80s when she finally told me her own story about her wounding, somewhat similar to your father. She was given away. She was one of 10 children, and she was given away by her parents
Mhm,
uh, to her aunt who had no children. And so my mom, this happened when she was 8 years old. So at the age of 8, having grown up as one of 10 children, she's now suddenly given it away with
mhm,
no advanced knowledge that this was going to happen. Just one day, her aunt and uncle came, visited the family. The children were all lined up in a row. My mother was the only one of the children, the 10, who had red hair.
mhm,
And unbeknownst to her, aunt and uncle had come to pick a child to take to be their child, to
mhm,
raise and have be their child. And they picked my mother because she stood out with her red hair. So they picked my mom, took her home with them, seemingly to be their child. Only my mother didn't go along with the program. As my mom told me this story, she's now in her late 80s. She cried for 3 weeks, and aunt and uncle brought her back home, took her back to her original family. But she was never the same after that. She was totally marked by that. And
mhm,
it explained so much to me about why my mother was the way she was,
mhm,
and why she conditioned me and gave me the messages that she did, which was, you need a man in your life.
mhm,
You need someone to take care of you. So I was never empowered growing up. I was never empowered to see myself as capable of being independent, as capable of creating my own life,
mhm.
which seems almost laughable to me now
Yeah,
when I realize who I've become.
yeah,
I have become so the opposite of that. And
yeah.
because of that, So here's an interesting little twist on this whole wounding thing. When we heal those wounds, those ancestral wounds in ourselves, which clearly was passed on to me through my mother, when we heal that, that healing becomes a source of our empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
That wound then becomes a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of now, as we look forward, generations forward,
Mm-hmm.
the healed, if we do the work on ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
which is the only way we can heal the ancestral wounding,
Mm-hmm.
because it is present in us now. And the only way it can be healed is to be healed in us now. So to do our own work. And then that becomes the gift that we pass forward.
Yes.
To future generations. So I see in my own daughters, they never got that message from me.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they got quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Messages of empowerment and messages of, you can do it. You can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do, to, own their own voice and own their own power, which my mother never did. My mother went to her grave. She
Mm-hmm.
died at 91, filled with unexpressed, incomplete emotions and feelings and anger and resentment and grieving, and all this stuff in her that she never had permission,
Mm-hmm.
that she never gave herself permission, never knew she could have permission
Great.
to express.
Great.
Right? Yeah.
So the healing process is one of conscious choice,
Yes.
recognizing that you have the choice, that own it. If I'm hearing you, like, as you describe your process, I'm trying to kind of sum it up for those who would be wanting to follow the steps. It sounds just like recognizing, first of all, the emotions, and recognizing you have choices and how you choose to move forward. That this, because I had the same message, it's like that I wasn't empowered. I needed a man to take care of me, and so similar, in terms of your journey, it's like at some point I made that decision. It's like, I don't need that. I can do this myself. And I remember my process being recognizing like that I have that choice. Is that how you would
Absolutely.
describe the process?
Yes. And there's an important piece here. And I think it is not only recognizing that you have a choice, but recognizing that it's not your issue, recognizing that it's not your wounding. Now, I will share that it took me 3 marriages and divorces to get, that is not what I came here for. I came here for exactly the opposite. I came here to be an empowered, independent woman, capable, which I certainly am, of taking care of myself. But I did not know that. I did not know that until I was almost 60 years old.
We have that in common. I was like three divorces, and mine was 62 years old that I finally got it.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. Mm-hmm.
And and when I finally woke up to the realization, hold on here a minute, I need a man to take care of me. No, that's not why I came. That was my mother's message to herself that she projected onto me, unconsciously, of course.
Right.
I don't fault her or blame her or resent her. I mean, I did. There was a time in my life when I did, until I healed it, until I did that work. But I certainly forgave her for that, because that came out of that deep wound of her own experience of being given away as a child, and the insecurity and the lack of confidence that embedded in her, not thinking that she was good enough, not thinking that she mattered, got passed on to me.
Right.
And another lineage wound that got passed on to me. Of course, it wasn't considered a wound back then. It wasn't considered a wound. that when women weren't empowered in previous generations, my mother's generation, my mother was born in 1910, and her mother before her was born in the 1800s. Women were not empowered in those generations to see themselves as capable and independent and in ownership of their voice.
Yeah.
So none of that got encouraged or promoted in me. And yet I'm very clear as I look back from the very beginning that I came for with a whole different agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to overcome that conditioning and that programming that I inherited from my mother.
Yes.
It took me a long time.
Yes. Yes. And your journey has been so powerful since. And I love that your article was published in 2011, which is actually a couple of years before some of the research that I've discovered on epigenetics. Some of the research was published. So I want to first define epigenetics. The Center for Disease Control defines epigenetics as the study of how your behavior and environment can cause changes to the way your DNA works. So unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible, and they don't change the DNA sequence, but they change how your body reads the DNA sequence. So what that means is that a trauma of some sort can actually change the DNA sequence. And that, according to epigenetics, can in fact, and research can in fact get passed on to those who follow. And so in 2015, a study was published by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who is associated with New York's Mount Sinai Hospital. And she studied 32 Jewish men and women who had been somehow involved during the Holocaust, either had been in a concentration camp or had hidden during that time. So clearly were traumatized by that situation. And they analyzed their genes as well as the genes of their children. And what they found is that there was an increased likelihood in the stress disorders of their children, that they noticed a difference in the gene changes that were both in the parents and the children. They were similar and different from others who lived in Europe at that time, but were not somehow involved we're not in a concentration camp or having to hide. So that there was something very marked in the DNA, the changes to the DNA of both the parents and the children. And a study also on mice. So I guess we have very similar DNA to mice, which is why mice are so often studied. So this was a 2013 study that was done on mice, and mice were exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms, and at the same time were given an electric shock treatment so that they became frightened eventually when they smelled the cherry blossoms. And what they found is that their offspring and their offspring's offspring also had a stress response when exposed to the smell of cherry blossom. So the offspring didn't have the electrical shock along with the cherry blossoms. They were just introduced to the smell, and yet they reacted the same way. And they noticed some also alterations to the genes of both the parent mice and the offspring. So there's this connection that appears to be going on biologically that indicates that a traumatic event from a parent can get shared with their children through this alteration of the gene, so that we can be carrying this trauma that isn't even ours. Yeah,
Yes. So I think to be aware of this completely shatters one's idea or thought that one doesn't matter. And we might inherit a belief or the conditioning from a parent because the parent didn't believe that they mattered,
right.
that we don't matter. And quite the opposite is that not only do we matter, but how we see ourselves matters. I was listening to a podcast this morning, as a matter of fact, in which Gabor Mate was discussing a quote by Jamie Lee Curtis, the
Mm,
actress, Jamie Lee Curtis, where she said, we are suffering let's see, how did she say it? Something like a catastrophe. That might not be the correct word, but we are suffering a catastrophe of authenticity.
mhm,
In that, the most important, the biggest impact of generational wounding, trauma, is invisibility.
mm,
When a parent is disconnected from themselves and therefore they do not have the ability to actually see who they are or know who they are,
mhm,
it obscures their ability to see who their child is
mhm,
and to know who their child is. And when a child grows up not being seen, not being seen and valued for who they are, not because of what they do, not because of what they achieve, none of that, but just simply because they are.
mm, mhm,
That trauma gets passed on. And I believe that was really the core of my mother's wounding,
mhm, mhm,
not having been seen or valued for who she was.
mhm,
I never felt seen by my mother.
mhm,
And I loved her. She was a beautiful, kind woman.
mhm.
She was also a very wounded woman. She
Yeah.
said to me a month before she passed away, my mom was lucid right up until a couple of days before she passed away at 91. She said to me a month before she died, she said, "You raised yourself, you know."
Mm,
I always knew that. I always felt that.
mhm,
I always felt that. I mean, it was my experience that I raised myself. The woman who was told, the person who was told she needed somebody to take care of her,
mhm,
didn't have anybody to take care of her. I raised myself. So when my mom told me that, it validated what I had felt and really knew. She confirmed it. I'd kind of known it all my life
yeah. That's
that I had,
interesting.
yeah, that I had raised myself. And it came out of her own ability to be visible to herself. My
Mhm,
mother had no idea who she was or of what she was capable, nor did she know that about me. My mother had no idea who I was right
absolutely.
up until she died. And
Yeah.
so um Gabor Mate was sharing in this podcast that I was listening to this morning that is the greatest generational wound.
Yeah.
And so that suggests that
Mm,
the greatest gift that we can give ourselves and those who come after in succeeding generations is to do the work on ourselves, is to know who we are,
yeah.
is to be connected and present to ourselves, which empowers us to be connected and present and see who's there, who our child is, who our partner is, who our friend, to see who people are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that makes me so passionate about the experience of life story writing, of going back and really connecting the dots of our lives and allowing ourselves to see ourselves and to accept ourselves, forgive ourselves, have self-compassion, and then allow ourselves to be seen by others when we share those stories. And then when we do that, when we share our self-acceptance, we're opening the door for those who follow us to do the same thing. And like you say, to be able to see them, when we're solid and comfortable in our own skin, then
Yes.
we can make space for others and to see them more authentically.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
That's certainly one way of healing this generational trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I know that there's lots of ways that you offer it too. So if others want to get in touch with you, Judith, how, I know you've got the podcast and then some other ways, how might they connect with you?
They can connect with me through my website, judithrich.com. There is a contact page on there. They can just, put in their name and email address. And I think there's a place where they can write a question, or they can send me an email, and we can be in touch that way.
Okay, great. And your podcast is on just where
My
all what's the name of the podcast?
Yes, you're right. It's on Apple and Spotify, and I think it's on a bunch of different platforms, and it's called The New Beyond.
Ah, love it. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much for saying yes and being here and having this discussion with me today. It's an important one.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanna. I
Huh.
really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if any of this is bringing things up for you who are listening, want to do a little bit of journaling on your own, then I invite you to, think back about something that you might be carrying that you have the sense that it doesn't belong to you. And think about it from the perspective of like, well, who might it belong to? And maybe this can help you let go of something you've been carrying that isn't yours. Maybe you can do some journaling around it to say, write about what messages you picked up from your parents or primary caregivers that you've carried with you and really isn't true for you anymore. It really isn't supporting you being empowered, feeling empowered, and also in showing up as your authentic self. Thank you for joining us today. Look forward to having you again with us next week on the Journey to Legacy show.